you may have heard Ewan McGregor's egregiously arrogant choose life speech from Irvine Welsh's heroin-fuelled novel Trainspotting, but writers such as Melvyn Burgess and Irvine Welsh are simply the most recent in a line of authors inspired by morphinomania. The impulse to use drugs may be a universal one, but they are also an acquired taste. A substance accepted as a religious sacrament in one culture can be seen as a public health problem in another. I intend to explore the literature which has become synonymous with crack dens and drug bazaars as I guide you through the alchemy of the written word. From opium to cannabis, laudanum to morphine and heroin, drug use, or collective intoxication to be more specific, has been bound up with social interaction. The opium dens of the East End of London in the mid-19th century, as depicted by the likes of Gustave Doré, became the hubs of iniquity, pleasure, and literary inspiration. Therefore, the literature I will explore speaks to all sinners and abstainers, juvenile and senile, masculine and feminine, to all abstainers, voluntary and involuntary, and to all the slaves of the opium poppy at home and abroad, whether experiencing the pleasures or pains of the seductive drug. In the 1840s, the relationships between the East and West were strained, leading to the Opium Wars and a complicated exploration of the politics of the poppy. Writers such as De Quincey wrote in his Opium War essays decidedly jingoistic accounts declaring with vigour the hypocritical Tory notion that opium was certainly not available to the poor, whilst at the same time pontificating that addiction and poverty were linked. Opium eating became imbibed within popular culture to the extent that contemporary writers such as Wilkie Collins wrote his novel The Moonstone in 1868, in which opium was used as a plot device owing to its commonplace nature in society. Charles Baudelaire, author of Les Fleurs de Mal, commented that amongst the drugs most efficient in creating what I call the artificial ideal, the most convenient and the most handy are hashish and opium. Prior to the wars in the 1840s, the Romantic poets were, to a point, synonymous with a heightening of the senses and engaged in any act of debauchery which allowed them deeper and richer access to their own emotions. Samuel Taylor Coleridge and Lord Byron were the embodiment of this, and the former was addicted to opium. Coleridge composed one of his most famous works after taking laudanum in 1797, after waking from a stupor in which he dreamed of the stately pleasure domes of a Chinese emperor. He scribbled Kubla Khan. Coleridge's addiction finally killed him in 1834. In 1870, Charles Dickens wrote The Mystery of Edwin Drood, in which drugs were used as a vehicle for the reader to solve a mystery, as it's used to obtain the truth, a literary veritaserum, if you will, predating that of J.K. Rowling and Harry Potter. If the novel had been finished, it's thought that perhaps this would have formed the basis for the first full psychological profile of a drug addict, owing to Dickens' verisimilitude when depicting laudanum use in his writing. We are, I am sure, all aware of Sherlock Holmes' drug use in Conan Doyle's stories, but in the lesser known The Man with the Twisted Lip, drug use serves more helpfully as a mirror to the problem of social identity in the Victorian era, rather than the creator of such problems, a concept which sits uneasily with the modern reader, law enforcer or teacher who wants to look to blame substance abuse for societal problems, rather than admit that its mind-altering qualities can actually be revelatory rather than corrupting. This moral dilemma is drawn upon by the likes of Oscar Wilde in the era of the fin de siècle at the end of the 19th century. He purported to be a follower of antinomianism and therefore freed from commonplace morality. In the same vein, drugs can be a social leveller as they destroy social hierarchy because of the direct access to emotions. This was another big problem for the Victorian aristocrat, who lived to be seen to be rather than for who he really is, thus giving way to such characters like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. It is therefore unsurprising that we have the likes of Sherlock Holmes, a respectable gentleman, brushing shoulders with scruffy ragamuffins in opium dens. It certainly gives new meaning to the term high society. Furthermore, Robert Louis Stevenson wrote the aforementioned novel in 1886 during a 6-day cocaine binge. His wife Fanny said that an invalid in my husband's condition of health should have been able to perform the manual labour alone of putting 60,000 words on paper in 6 days. Seems almost incredible. However, it's not just men who are depicted in literature as habitual drug users. Celebrity figures such as Elizabeth Siddal, commonly known as art's greatest supermodel and the inspiration for the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, was addicted to laudanum. She's thought to be the muse behind Richard Price and his text An Evil Spirit, written in 1887. It depicts female addiction and, owing to the patriarchal dominance at the time, therefore reveals a demonic mind rather than the tortured bodies of earlier depictions of drug use. In the text, the language is derivative of moral corruption and degradation, when it's described that her eyes are full of trouble and wanting. The shift towards depictions of female drug use cast a pall over the drug market and led to its decline in popularity amongst aristocratic circles. The impact of figures such as Lizzie Sadal can still be seen in contemporary culture, and the use of over-the-counter Valium in the USA in the 1960s, during which time it was known colloquially as Mother's Little Helper, thus perpetuating the stereotype created by Richard Price that female addicts must be weak and feeble-minded as opposed to the male addicts of the mid-19th century who were simply reaching for the higher echelons of truth and pleasure. Continually, Ayn Rand, author of The Fountainhead in 1942, a novel about achieving success on one's own terms, came under scrutiny from her friends and contemporaries regarding her addiction to amphetamines. Her close friend and journalist, Isabel Patterson, implored her to stop taking the drugs as she could not possibly claim to never fake reality in any manner whilst writing under the influence. The battle with both prescription and illegal drugs alike pervaded the artistic world of the 20th century, as it had done in the 19th century. However, imbibers were striving for a deeper connection with their emotions, yes, but perhaps more importantly, a mind-opening and pace-quickening effect more akin to the faster-paced world in which they were living. In The Doors of Perception, Aldous Huxley's famous 1954 book, which inspired Jim Morrison's choice of band name, Huxley recounts at length his experience on the drug mescaline. Found naturally in the peyote cactus, mescaline induces hallucinations, and it's these Huxley found opened his mind and inspired him to write his book. Similarly, Stephen King wrestled his scariest monster, his addiction to alcohol and cocaine, as he penned titles such as Cujo, Pet Sematary, It, and Misery in the 1980s. He admitted, with cocaine, one snort, and it just owned me body and soul. Throughout the last 200 years, addiction has been both a cruel yet seductive mistress to the countless writers who populate the list of the colloquially named stoner canon. Their overzealous quest for truth and their hunger for enlightenment, escapism, and heightened connections to hyper-reality is enabled by drug use. However, their substance abuse is tragically both the breaker of chains and the ties that eventually bind. In the words of Arthur Symons in his poem The Opium Smoker, I am engulfed and drowned deliciously soft music like perfume, this bed of straw, this worn-out body like a tattered tent, this crust of which the rats have eaten part, this pipe of opium, rage, remorse, despair, this soul at pawn and this delirious heart.